As we look ahead to Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana's maiden budget speech, the South African Federation of Trade Unions will be embarking on protest action. Ahead of this speech, the union is demanding, among other things, the implementation of the basic income grant. What should the Finance Minister be prioritizing in his first speech? Here to talk to me about this, I'm joined by Saftu spokesperson Trevor Shaku, as well as economist Dawie Roodt. Gentlemen, good evening, and thank you very much for your time and joining us tonight here on In Focus. Economists have said the minister is expected to manage spending pressure, balance that with market expectations, and that he keeps government in check as far as the debt levels are concerned, that they remain manageable. Is that it in a nutshell? Is that what you're expecting, Dawie?
Good evening to you. Well, every year when I talk about the budget, I say this is going to be different because there are special challenges. But I can tell you this time around, we have never had it so difficult. There's never been a budget in the history of South Africa where the Minister of Finances is facing so many challenges that we have currently. The bottom line basically is that the state's debt levels have become completely and totally unsustainable. Debt is going up too fast, and the only answer to that is to spend less money. And that, of course, is politically quite difficult to do because there are more than 30 million people receiving an income from the state every month. And inevitably, if you want to spend less, you must spend less money on people. And if you spend less money on people, people will start getting angry. The other alternative, of course, is try to increase taxes. But I can tell you, and I've analyzed all the different taxes, is that increasing taxes in South Africa is simply not possible. Of course, it's always possible, but the damage to the economy and chances that you're going to collect more money is really quite slim, and increasing taxes really is not an option anymore. So the only alternative is cutting back on state spending, but politically, that's a difficult thing to do.
Yeah. Trevor, I suppose for Treasury, the important thing here, money will be better spent on creating jobs and investing in water, power, and other such infrastructure. However, the argument for additional support for the poor is one that has particularly been strong in the country. But if you listen to what the President said in the State of the Nation address, the basic income grant is certainly not something that will be in this particular budget vote, although there is an extension of the SDR grant.
There are a number of things which I think we must iron out in this debate of whether government is at levels, debt levels have reached levels where government has no room to spend. The premise which the neoliberal economists use, unfortunately, is that we call the tax and borrow first before you can spend. Now, the ideological premise of that and its operational mechanics is that government cannot spend any longer because at this current moment, for instance, they would use debt to GDP ratio or they would use the deficit. Now, the two categories are important to analyze, of course, but the first one, debt to GDP ratio, which they use to create a story that the government cannot afford any further expenditure on social goods and services, is merely a quantitative comparison of what the government has spent and what the GDP has grown with. Meaning if the GDP grows at a very accelerated rate, the debt to GDP ratio will shrink, even if we were to spend at the rate at which we are spending. The second one is that which compares the deficit to the revenue, the debt to the revenue, what government spent versus what government collects from those who are taxpayers. Now, the studies have shown that government does not have to rely on tax and does not have to rely on tax to spend, especially a country like South Africa, which is a currency issuer, can always be able to have a room to spend. Now, what they are doing here is that they are trying to deflate the real issues of what underlies the operational mechanics of fiscal and monetary policy in this sovereign currency with what government is following in their neoliberal ideological outlooks. Now, Now, the problem always arises there, and they try to scaremonger us not to demand further expenditure on social goods and services. And we refuse that. One thing which we, as the South African Federation of Trade Unions and other social movements, is that we cannot continue to have a situation where we do not we have 12.5 million of our people unemployed. They do not have any form of income. We have our schools crumbling because they do not have enough infrastructure. They cannot hire more teachers. Our hospitals, the same. They do not have infrastructure, equipment. They cannot hire people. The various departments which are responsible to giving 70% of our population public services and goods cannot be able to deliver because of budget cuts. And we are going to, as the South African Federation of Trade Unions, have to put a serious standoff against the neoliberals and the government they serve.
Yeah, others will argue that, well, if we don't want to see budget cuts, what certainly needs to happen is to widen the tax base so that we get a little bit more revenue. And there's argument now that, well, government has got a little bit of revenue overrun, but they'll tell you that that has already been spent in a whole lot of mitigating measures around COVID-19 and so on and so forth. So how do we widen that tax base? Trevor?
Look, the tax serves a very different purpose to what these neoliberals have taught us. Mostly we are told that tax are meant to ensure that government collects so that it can spend. But in reality, what you have is that government can be able to issue bonds and spend. But remember, even bond issuance does not necessarily mean that government rely on bonds in order to spend. Government can ensure that it spends its way up into the, for instance, you have countries which have debt to GDP ratios which are very high and have deficits which are very high. But those particular governments continue to thrive in terms of economic growth, employment creation and all that. So what we are trying to say here is that government does not have to rely on tax. So you don't have to expand tax revenue before you can be able to commit certain levels of expenditure on social goods and services.
Right, Dawie, weighing on that, government does not have to rely on tax. Government doesn't have to collect to spend. They can issue bonds and spend, certainly is one option on the table tonight.
Dawie, I'm really trying very hard to understand what Trevor is trying to tell me here, because what I've heard is that government does not need taxes, and government maybe or maybe do not need bonds in order to get money to spend. So my really simple question to Trevor is, so where's the money going to come from? If you want to spend money, where are you going to get the money to spend? And the simple answer is exactly the same as a household. In my house, I earn a salary and I use my money to spend on food and for rent and electricity and all that. And the government is nothing different from that. They must get the money somewhere in order to spend. I just don't know what Trevor's idea is and how you're going to spend more than what you're getting in, unless you borrow money. So if I go to the bank and borrow more money, the bank will lend me some money. But the day is going to come when the bank is going to tell me, listen, I'm not going to lend you any more money because you can't repay me the money. Yes, it is true what Trevor is saying about some countries with higher debt levels than South Africa. Japan is a very good example. Their debt levels are approximately 300% of GDP. Our comparable levels are around about 70% of GDP. But the Japanese government, if they borrow money, they pay just about no interest. In the case of South Africa, we pay about 10% interest. So the debt level in itself is not necessarily important. It's a combination of debt levels and, of course, the interest that you're paying on that debt. But I would really like to know where Trevor gets this idea that you can spend money that you did not get anywhere.
So, sorry, I forgot to mention that option. I think it did also mention you can borrow to spend, you can issue bonds to spend, yes, or you can collect to spend. Right, Trevor? Is that pretty much where you're saying?
I think there are 3 points which I must flag out for debate here. The first one is that he compares himself to the state. Now, he's very different to the state. He's the currency user and the state is the currency issuer. Now, there is necessarily a difference there. Now, a currency user awaits on somebody who has to issue the currency in order to spend it in the first place. But the currency issuer cannot wait on anybody in order to spend its way out of the crisis which it finds itself. They call it debt. Of course, they call it debt because it is the net expenditure above the tax collection revenue, right? The second thing which we must highlight is that the reason why I mentioned that you can still issue bonds in order to finance, it is merely to offset and to ensure that you create capacity for expenditure. But bonds selling does not necessarily dictate or put a limit or restriction on the ability of government to spend. Government can spend even more than that. The reason why governments engage in bond sales in most instances is so that they try to avoid the inflation, so the driving down the interest rate, because the selling of bonds in the financial markets allows the commercial banks to buy the bonds, but by buying bonds, it then reduce the level of excess reserves that are in the financial markets. Now, governments engage, at the same time they spend, they engage in bond issuance, mainly as a measure to ensure that they target interest rate and ensure that the interest rate is not driven down. Because if you have excess reserves in the financial market, especially in the interbank market, you would have to have these banks competing amongst one another, and that on its own would drive the interest rates down. So in that instance, the very basis of bond issuance is not necessarily to ensure to say this is the start and all of expenditure for government.
Yeah.
So the third thing which I think one must mention is that you have a government of South Africa, which is a sovereign currency issuer. And in this instance, even if government was to spend its way out of its crisis, the crisis we find ourselves in, the crisis of lack of services, the crisis of unemployment, the crisis of lack of growth, we will still be able to do that. The thing is, even if we were to issue these bonds, because we're the currency issuers, we will never default in paying back these bonds. Unlike, for instance, what Godongwana did not long ago by attaining a World Bank loan. A World Bank loan denominated in the foreign currency, of course, brings problems of its own into the government's capability and capacity to be able to service its bonds, to service its debt.
So Trevor, let me take a break. We'll come back and you can expand on that. But I just want to get clarity, a quick one. The monetary policy strategy you are suggesting, it sounds very close to what many have been suggesting as quantitative easing. Is that what you're referring to?
No, it's very different. But we'll explain quantitative easing if we must go into it.
All right, we'll come back in a moment and you can explain that a little bit further for us. Welcome back live tonight here on In Focus as we look ahead to the budget speech on Wednesday. Debate is on then on what the Finance Minister should prioritize. Saftu spokesperson Trevor Shaku and economist Dawie Roodt with us tonight here on In Focus. All right, Trevor, explain to us in simple terms so that everybody understands what you're saying, because you are in a sense saying government should introduce bonds, right, into the economy so that they can expand their spend. But you're saying it's completely different to what quantitative easing is. So what is the difference?
I'm not saying it should introduce bonds. Bonds are already there. The government treasuries are a way in which treasury and the government consolidated sector, which brings the Reserve Bank and Treasury together, are already operating on. What I'm proposing is that, and maybe it may be shocking, because I'm saying that government must spend because it's the currency issue. It does not have to wait for anything. What I'm proposing is further that the bond issuance is introduced and is used mainly to ensure that they drain out the excess reserves in the interbank market, where is a lot of reserves, ensuring that commercial banks trade with them on it, ensure that commercial banks run their own accounts on a daily basis and are able to even expand their credit facilities, loans, and that and that. The other thing, which is quantitative easing, which we are bringing into equation, is that quantitative easing is something different, because quantitative easing does not mean necessarily spending directly into a provision of public goods and services.
Yeah.
It means in most instances that government introduce flood the interbank market with reserves, and it is in the interbank market with those reserves, with the hope that the various financial institutions, commercial banks in particular, which are in the primary, which are the primary franchise of the central bank, you may say, so that it is them who eventually would have to determine whether the credit facilities they extend reach out to people in, for instance, aimed sectors.
Yeah.
What other governments have actually done in the past is that they introduce quantitative easing with a window guidance. For instance, when they flood the interbank market with reserves, they ensure that they even guide the commercial banks as to who to lend and as to who to give credit facilities to. For instance, we would, if for instance, Ramaphosa and Godongwana were tomorrow to say there is quantitative easing, we want to develop a sector that produces the finished goods of the minerals we have. We are going to ensure that we flag this, and this quantitative easing is aimed, we guide the commercial banks that the major lending beneficiaries of these lendings would have to be a particular sector.
All
so
right.
Quantitative easing then comes into play. But what I'm proposing is not that. It's that government
must print money, must literally print currency and spend its way out of this situation.
It's not necessarily printing money, of course, in the literal sense.
Yeah.
But for instance, when commercial banks create money into existence, they create it through credit facility, credit creation, and loan creation, for instance.
Yeah.
And most loans and credit facilities are an introduction of new money into the system.
Yeah.
Why are these commercial banks able to bring money into existence without any of the burdens that government is being carried by this neoliberal?
Cool.
It's being put.
I hear what you're saying. So, Dawie, I don't know if you get carried. The government must introduce currency into the system and not be burdened, because banks can do it. Why is government burdened by this idea that they can introduce money into the system? And is that really the solution to help us in the immediate, not theory, but let us print money, currency, where the currency issue up, introduce it into the system. What will be the impact?
I don't really know how to react to Trevor's comments that he's made. And I must tell you, I have a little bit of a problem with this debate tonight, because it's very clear to me that Trevor does not understand the basics. And I'm talking about really basics. I'm talking about economics 101, about monetary policy and fiscal policy and things like that. So I really do not understand. I don't understand his arguments. I think what he's trying to say is that government should start creating more money out of nothing. And by the way, quantitative easing is not conducted by the fiscal authorities, it's conducted by the monetary authorities. So you have to get past the Lesetja Kanyago if you want to do that. But I don't have words for this debate for tonight, because I love to talk about economics. I love to explain how it works. I really love to talk about ideologies. I like to debate certain issues. But this is not a debate. I mean, this is, you want me to debate with Trevor. Trevor, I'm sure you're a nice guy, but really you don't understand the really basics about economics. Quantitative easing is when a central bank goes out there and buys certain financial instruments. Instead of, I'm not even going to explain it to you, but they buy certain financial instruments. And I think what you are alluding to is something that is called modern monetary theory. Basically, what it means is that the government takes over the. Again, I'm really at a loss of words. I don't know what to tell you because clearly, Trevor, that yeah, you have to start maybe doing a little bit of reading.
What is the solution? What we're trying to get to here, Dawie, is what is the solution for the debt situation, and where do we find? I think the big question everybody's asking is where do we find the money? And Trevor is trying to provide some solution of where we find the money.
Okay, let me just give you a very quick rundown on how the fiscal accounts work. The fiscal account is basically government running the fiscus. The name fiscus means it's a basket in which taxes are collected. It's an old Latin word. But basically what it comes down to is that the Minister of Finance needs to spend money. And he needs to spend money, and in order for him to spend money, he needs to get money from two places, basically. He can tax people, or he can borrow more money. And that's exactly what he's doing. Now, we can analyze whether he can tax more or less, and we can analyze and we can discuss about what kind of taxes to increase or reduce, whatever. But the reality is that the tax burden in the country is quite high. You can borrow more money, and you can always borrow more money, but the reality also is that the debt levels in South Africa are quite high, and people are not very happy to keep on lending money to the state. That leaves you with one option only, and that's for the state to spend less money. And they need to spend less money, and we can debate on what, but they need to spend less money.
Yeah.
If they don't do that, if they don't spend less money, then the people lending money to the state are going to get angry and say, listen, I don't want to lend money to the state anymore, and they're going to stop lending money to the state, and interest on state debt will simply going up. If the state decides that they're going to nationalize the Reserve Bank, as an example, and they're going to start printing money, then money will just lose its value. It's called inflation. And there are many examples of this in history. So if you want to follow something called modern monetary theory, for example, then you are heading for very high levels of inflation, and that's going to destroy all sort of things and economic growth in the country as well. Yeah. If we want to grow this economy, there are a couple of things that we need to do. But the first thing that we need to establish confidence in South Africa. We need to get people to understand and to believe that South Africa is a good place to invest in, and it's a good place to do business in. And if we can get people to believe in that, then people may start to invest in the country. And if they start investing in the country, it will lead to more production in the country, and eventually more wealth creation, and eventually more job creations, and eventually a reduction in poverty in the country as well. Yeah. But if you want to start and doing all sort of funny shenanigans and funny things like printing money and doing all sort of financial engineering, then all it's going to happen, people are simply going to say, listen, I don't trust this government. And exactly that is what people feel at the moment. And they're not going to invest in here. And it's not complicated at all. Yeah. If I want a driver's license, it is very difficult to get it. If I want to drive from A to B, there are many potholes. Yeah. If I have to go to the police station, then the police are corrupt quite often. Right. If I want to have a good school, then the school quality is very bad compared to the rest of the world. So the list just goes on and on.
In simple terms, if we're speaking to you on the modern monetary theory, your argument against this is that inflation will go up.
There's very little doubt about that. Yeah. Is that if you print money and you make a lot of money, and the central bank, the Reserve Bank, can do that. Unfortunately, we have Lesetja Kganyago there, which is not doing that. But if you start printing money and you just print money and throw it out of helicopters, then everybody will have a lot of money, and all that's going to happen is that there's more money, but not more goods, and things will get more expensive. And the name for that is inflation. Money will simply lose its value. That is what will happen with modern monetary theory. And I think that is what Trevor is trying to establish.
I'm completely out of time. Trevor, as we wrap up, just a quick 30 seconds. I mean, what do you make of the possible ramifications of that measure of simply printing money?
No. He's angry because we are interrupting the dominant way of thinking in the economics. But most importantly, is also misrepresenting these things. You see, the only way spending into the economy can be inflationary is if, for instance, the very private sector he represents does not expand production. I mean, what creates inflation? What creates inflation is when people have more money to spend and there's less to consume or to buy, rather. So the main thing is that if government, if the private sector expands production, as more people begin, for instance, with the 1,500, we are looking for the basic income grant. If that grant is introduced, but instead of the private sector raising prices, it expands production, we are going to evade the inflationary risks which is mentioned.
All right.
But another thing which we must also dispel, Thabo, before we go, is that he thinks that because they have had an ideological hegemony in the economics and how governments run their fiscus, therefore that is going to be a serious scandal if we are beginning to challenge it. And I understand why he's in the main.
Unfortunately, I am out of time. So I'm going to bring you back. We need more debate on this. I see that Trevor is raring to go and wants to add more to it. All right. I appreciate your time. That is Saftu's spokesperson, Trevor Shaku, and economist Dawie Roodt, as we build up to the budget on Wednesday.